Good morning, friends. Well, let me welcome you to another session. We are discussing the poems of Philip Larkin that are on our syllabus. We have already discussed the poems. So, what remains for us is to discuss certain topics, certain aspects of Larkin's poetic oeuvre that we find very important for the time being. You see, every year, for every batch of students, a teacher actually deals with a particular text or an author, a poet, certain poems, or any text for that matter, from a particular perspective. And it depends on that particular perspective as to which topics he or she, that means the teacher, will consider important for that particular way of reading the poems or any text for that matter. Now, I have circulated a list of topics but before I had done it, when I had not yet discussed the poems of Philip or tackled Philip Larkin's poems, and since the teaching learning experience is always a dynamic process, I think we may reconsider the topics a bit. Even though the basic drift will remain the same, the phraseology may change, and somehow the approach may change a bit. You see, I have shared 8 topics with you. Now, so far as the poems are concerned, the 5 poems are concerned, you know, I have already told you to study the poems in detail, comprehensively. And because I have discussed all the poems, I have highlighted various aspects of the poems. So, for example, certain poems can be read in a particular way, but some of the poems have many aspects to deal with. So obviously, I will strongly suggest that you, while studying these poems, you prepare your response to the poem in a comprehensive manner. What do I mean? Now think about a poem like Once by Philip Larkin. What is the poem all about? It is about the modern life. It is about the post-war, post-Second World War life. It was published in the 1950s. And it is also about the English life, the life of the working class people, urban English men and women in the mid-20th century. Now, urbanization, mechanization, industrialization, and consolidation. These were the things that British society, British polity had been trying at that particular time. Because England had lost her empire, and as a result, the prestige and power was on the wane. Prestige and power were on the wane. So obviously, an element of disillusionment is to be detected in and through this poem, throughout the poem. Now, so far as another poem is concerned, say, for example, the explosion. We all know it's about coal mine disaster. And even though this actually describes one particular disaster, as I had told you in no uncertain terms, in fact, Larkin had a BBC documentary about coal mine accidents in his mind while writing this particular poem. So obviously, this is a poem on disaster. That is there. Yes, thematically, there are many things. For example, it is a description of the miner's life. In a way, there is also an element of hope or optimism in the face of a terrible tragedy. But it can be read as a poem on disaster, as a disaster poem. Now, what about the other poems? Say, yes, Charge Going can be read as a religious poem with a difference. But don't you think it can also very easily be read as a case study, as a specimen of Larkin's use of irony? You see, think about the title. I have already told you. It can be the act of going to the church. It can also be church going, the decline of the church as an institution, as well as an idea. So these things are there. You see, if you read Charge Going, for example, you will see that there are many instances of irony. We all know that irony actually, as a literary or artistic trope, operates within the interstices of the apparent and the real. So obviously, look at this poem. Think about the awkward reverence with which the speaker actually takes off his cycling clips before entering the church. Larkin's use of irony is really remarkable on account of the fact that often the object, the target of his irony is himself. So on the time, in this particular poem, he is presenting himself as a bored, uninformed, a kind of a stupid, ignorant bungler. But as we go on reading the poem, we see that it is much of a pose. Because Larkin seems to know, that means the Larkin persona at least, seems to know much about the church rituals, church architecture, the significance of the church, and so on and so forth. Think about the way he uses the phrase "here endeth" instead of "amen." Think about the way he donates an Irish sixpence. Think about the way he speculates upon the possible use of the church in decline. Maybe dubious women, superstitious women will come and seek cures for all the ailments of their children. Think about the way the persona speculates on the kind of people who may visit the church after even disbelief has gone. Disbelief in church as an institution, church as a serious house on serious earth has been dissipated. So in a way, this poem can also be read, if you remember, as a kind of a tentative validation of hope and heritage. In face of and notwithstanding the atmosphere of boredom and isolation that the post-war England was conducive to. Okay, think about another poem. The Whitsun Weddings. Yes, it can already be very easily be read as a poem on departure. It is basically a journey poem. But can it not be read also as a poem about, say, post-war Britain and the post-war British society? Because it was published in the 1960s, in 1964, as a title poem of the Whitsun Weddings. So this much is very much there. Even a moral philosophical reading of the poem may be on the cards. So far as Adgrass is concerned, again, it can be read as a post-imperial poem, but it can also be read as a poem about age. Again, an allegorical poem. Because the horses are allegorical figures in some ways. They represent the ultimate ravages of time. They also represent our heroic struggle, our fortitude against the inevitable loss of vitality and maybe loss of life in the long run. Loss of youth, loss of fame, loss of power, and so on and so forth. So, since I have discussed the poems separately and in some detail, I will tell you to prepare your response to the poems in a comprehensive manner. Okay. So far as the other three questions are there, the other three topics are there. Now, just understand this. Larkin as a movement poet. Larkin as an uncommon poet of and for the common man. And the justification of a comment made by Jan Ausby about Larkin. Because I thought these will be very, very important. At least on the basis of my reading of the poems with you in a particular way. Maybe next time when I tackle Larkin, I will do it from a different perspective with a slightly different drift, maybe. Because there are many aspects of the Larkin oeuvre that we cannot actually explore all in total, absolutely comprehensively. So far as the evaluation of Larkin as a movement poet is concerned. Now, Larkin has been called a movement poet because he was a contemporary of poets like Robert Conquest, Donald Davy, D.J. Enright, Elizabeth Jennings, John Wayne, Kingsley Amis, Tom Gunn, and so on and so forth. Because his poems appeared in Conquest's anthology, New Lines. Because he shared with this loose group of poets, loosely made group of poets, certain common features. He has often been extolled as the foremost of the movement poets. Blake Morrison, for example, in his seminal book on movement poetry, has given a place of prominence to Larkin, the pride of place in a way. Ian Hamilton, A. Alvarez, all these writers have highlighted the fact that in some ways, even John Press, they have pointed out how Larkin shared certain features of his poetry with the other movement poets. Now, in order to consider Larkin as a movement poet, we have to think about certain features that he may have with his poetic peers. Now, we all know what generational gap is. Generation gap means that, every new generation tries to deviate from the influence and the norm of the earlier generation. So in a way, the commonality between Larkin and the other movement poets may first be described as a negative affinity. They were all against, these movement poets were all against the vapid romanticism and the over intellectual virtuosity of the poets in the 30s and 40s on the one hand, and people like Ezra Pound and Eliot, whose poems they had treated, if not with absolute neglect, at least with studied indifference. You know, movement poetry was basically characterized by a few things. Number one, the target audience, readership, was the common man. As a result, the vocabulary used and the tone of the poems had to be made, number one, clearer, and number two, simpler. In the teeth of the deliberate obscureness and elitist propensities of people like Eliot and others, and his ilk. Actually, these Second World War English poets did not or could not identify with people like Dylan Thomas and even Ernest Thomas. They were different. Their poetry was clearer, simpler, and yet they had an organized structure so far as the basic approach of the movement poets was concerned. Larkin, like the other movement poets, was more modest in his objective. He was not trying to mold and mend. He was not trying to dictate culture to a generation like someone like, say, Eliot was doing. On the contrary, he was quite satisfied with his fellow movement poets to go on reflecting the kind of culture that he found. He inherited and inhabited. And, there is also some kind of an ironic outlook. Think about it. Think about a poem. I have already discussed charge going. So let me take up for discussion a poem like The Whitsun Weddings. In a way, The Whitsun Weddings, like say, Prophthalamian, is supposed to, at least on one level, celebrate marriages. But you see, Larkin is reflecting or describing or commenting on such marriages as an outsider, a detached outsider. And his approach is quite ironic because, you know, like bulk purchase of grocery and other things, many marriages are described. And not a single couple is individualized or described in any detail. So, Larkin can very easily be considered, evaluated, and categorized as a movement poet. Now, so far as Larkin's credentials as an uncommon poet for common men is concerned, just think about the poems that you have read. Both the Larkin persona and the described or represented humanity can only be classified as common and ordinary. Maybe lower middle class or middle class and working class. They are not elites. You know, this element of commonness, ordinariness, is something that actually helps Larkin to establish a direct contact between the poet and the readers. As a result, Larkin was a popular poet. Even though a kind of a minor classic, he was a popular poet in his day. But wherein lies the uncommonness of Larkin as a poet of the common masses? Wherein lies the uncommonness? You will see that the uncommonness lies, number one, in his wry, dignified simplicity, in his conservatism. He's often working with conventional things, conventional meter, conventional poetic forms, and very, very colloquial, everyday language. But what makes him uncommon is his keenness of observation, is his generosity of disposition. Generosity of disposition. And also his effortless craftsmanship. Superb craftsmanship. So he has extended the scope and range of post-war British poetry in a big way. So with this, we come to the end of our discussion of Larkin. What I will do after this will be to revisit WBEX, because I think I have not discussed the the topics on WBEX that I had circulated beforehand. So if you have any question to ask, you may now ask me. Is there any question? It seems there are none. Well, in that case, Shamim Siddiq, you will just remove me from the class.